Orchestras do not operate like a standard business. Almost every professional orchestra in the world loses money on every ticket itself, and they do it on purpose. In this video, I'm going to explain the strange economics of keeping an orchestra alive, why the ticket you buy does not come close to covering your seat, where the rest of the money actually comes from, and why that is by design and not by failure. If you find this interesting, hit that like button. It helps more people find this content. All right, let's get into it. Welcome to the Arts Workplace. I'm Amy. I've spent my entire career in arts administration, and I created this channel to share what I've learned with the arts and culture community. Let's start with the math behind your concert ticket. When you buy a ticket for a symphony performance, you probably believe that your ticket purchase is paying for that concert experience, but it's not. I have spent most of my arts career working for a Group 1 U.S. orchestra. When you compare benchmarking data across similarly sized orchestras, you find that earned income, which is primarily ticket sales, covers roughly 35% of what it actually costs to present an orchestra season. Only 35%. And that's not a badly run orchestra. That is simply the business model this industry runs on. But it hasn't always been this way. 30 years ago, orchestras across the field were covering about 60% of their budgets through earned income alone. But that share has been sliding for decades, and it is sliding for a very specific structural reason, which is exactly where we're headed next. The musicians, the staff, the production equipment, the marketing, all of it costs far more than the tickets bring in. And that gap is built into the orchestra operating model. So why is breaking even so difficult for an orchestra? Here's the reason, and it has a name. Economists call it the cost disease, and it was first described using performing arts groups. In almost every industry, technology makes work cheaper over time. Work that once took 10 people to complete now only takes one. But that's only true for certain kinds of work. A string quartet performance still takes the same 4 musicians, the same 40 minutes it took 200 years ago. You cannot make it more efficient. A full orchestra multiplies that problem across 80 or more musicians playing together every single performance. That is not a cost you can engineer away. It is what live music actually is. Now compare that to other live art forms. A play or opera might run with a cast of 6 to 10 people. A jazz trio is 3 people. But a full orchestra needs 80 skilled specialists in the room together at the same time, every single performance, just to play the piece as it was written. That is an unusually labor-heavy way to make art, which is why orchestras feel this cost disease much harder than many other art forms. The administrative side of an orchestra is a different story. Ticketing, marketing, fundraising, finance, they all benefit from the same technology everyone else does, assuming we can afford the technology. More on that later. The stage does not. You can make the office more efficient. You cannot make the orchestra more efficient without it stopping being an orchestra. That is the meaning of cost disease. And it is specific to the one part of our business that we can never change. So why not just charge more for tickets? That is an obvious question I've heard many times. And some research on orchestra ticket pricing actually finds that demand is less price sensitive than you might expect, meaning revenue could rise if prices went up. But many believe the benefit from that is short term, and we are playing a longer game. Today's $25 first-time ticket buyer is potentially tomorrow's subscriber and donor. Price them out too early, and you do not just lose a ticket sale, you lose your entire pipeline. But it's not only about protecting that pipeline. Orchestras want their music to belong to everyone, regardless of background or income, not just the people who can afford it. That is our mission. That is our sole purpose. So pricing for maximum revenue versus pricing for accessibility are competing ideas, and accessibility is much more aligned with the mission. And even in the best case, the math does not get you there. Closing the whole gap through ticket price increases alone would mean roughly tripling what a ticket costs. And so demand could collapse long before you get what you need. So instead of closing the gap via admissions, this field looks to other means of financing. So if tickets do not cover that expense, what does? Well, orchestras are nonprofit 501c3 organizations, and we run on two kinds of funding: earned revenue, which includes revenue streams like ticket sales, service fees, concessions, and then contributed revenue, which is donations from individuals, grants, corporate sponsorships, and an endowment. Now, earlier I mentioned some stats for Group 1 orchestras. And so here's the flip side of those figures. Contributed revenue represents roughly 45 to 55% of our total revenue. So for most orchestras, contributed revenue, your donations, is not just bonus money. It is the entire foundation of our organization. We could not exist without it. The concert you attend is quietly underwritten by donors and institutions you will never see named on your ticket. And contributed revenue is a term used to describe many sources of funding. Individual donors typically account for somewhere around half to maybe 2/3 of contributed revenue for orchestras. So they are by far the largest piece of that. Government support, by contrast, typically makes up only a few percentage points, somewhere around 4%. So if you ever assume that American orchestras run on government funding, you're wrong. It is largely individuals like you, one gift at a time, filling in the gap that ticket sales cannot close. If you are still with me and enjoying this content, please hit that subscribe button. Now, here is the part that reframes everything. You may disagree, but this is not a broken business model. It's simply a different kind of model and institution. Some things a society values cannot fully pay for themselves. So the real question is not whether the ticket covers the cost. It is what all of this buys for a community. One recent economic impact study on an orchestra similar to my own found that orchestra generated about $125 million in regional economic impact. It supported around 1,900 jobs. That works out to close to $4 flowing back into the economy for every single dollar spent. And that's through jobs, tourism, and spending at nearby restaurants and hotels. And that is on top of the education programs provided by the orchestra to school children, reaching kids who would otherwise never have the opportunity. But there is a deeper reason this exists, and economists actually have a name for it. It's called existence value. It is the benefit you get from simply knowing something still exists, whether or not you ever walk through the door. It is the same logic behind saving an historical building you will never step foot inside. An orchestra carries its own version of that. A recording can preserve the sound of a piece written 200 years ago, but it cannot preserve the skill required to play that piece. That only survives because musicians are still rehearsing and performing it today and passing what they know on to the next generation. So if you stop funding that, you do not just lose concerts, you lose the knowledge and the cycle that keeps the skill itself alive. Losing money on tickets is not the failure of the model. Losing money on tickets is the model. It is intentional. It was never supposed to pay for itself at the door. It was built to pay off somewhere else, in the economy around it, and in what it keeps alive that nothing else can. Which is also why orchestras are fragile in a very specific way. When the economy takes a turn for the worse, or a major donor steps back, or habits of buyers shift, the gap that contributions normally covers suddenly and unexpectedly grows much wider and has to be closed by someone very fast. That is the quiet math behind the headlines you sometimes see. One of the most notable examples of this in recent history was the Philadelphia Orchestra. Back in 2011, the Philadelphia Orchestra became the first major American orchestra to file for bankruptcy because it was weighed down by a structural deficit of $14.5 million. And this was not because people stopped loving the music or attending concerts. Ticket revenue, donation revenue, and endowment income all softened at the same time, and so the gap that contributions normally cover could not be closed fast enough. But here's the part worth slowing down on. The deficit is not actually what forced that decision. A deficit is a yearly gap between revenue and expenses, and an organization can survive one for a while if it has cash reserves. What actually pushes a board into bankruptcy is running out of the cash to cover this month's bills, which includes payroll for the staff and musicians, while everyone is still working on solutions to bring in more money. Philadelphia's own board pointed to rapidly dwindling operating funds alongside the deficit, not just the deficit alone. That is the real distinction. It is rarely just the size of the hole. It is whether there's enough cash in the bank account to keep the lights on while the organization digs out of it. And once you understand the model, headlines like that make a lot more sense. There's a reason a collapse like that can happen very fast. Most orchestras run on a very thin cash cushion, maybe 8 weeks of operating expense held in reserve. And that's for healthy institutions, which is not much runway if your donations or ticket sales are declining while your expenses are rising. Have you heard of inflation? Well, when that cash runs out, the show literally cannot go on. You no longer have funds to market your concerts or pay the artists to perform on stage or pay the staff to operate the building. The orchestras that remain healthy are those that build a cash cushion and have the discipline not to spend that cushion every time a shortfall occurs. That same discipline applies to the endowment. An endowment is another critical source of funding for orchestras. This is a large pool of donations that is placed into an investment account to earn interest. And so only the investment income and a small annual percentage of the account is spent so that the fund can continue to grow and generate money indefinitely. Orchestras typically draw down somewhere around 4 to 5% of their endowment each year, a rate designed to ensure that the fund keeps growing. But when orchestras get into difficult financial situations, in other words, when the cash runs out, they often look to their endowments for help. The problem is when that becomes habit, eventually you spend down the revenue source that is supposed to outlast you. And it has a negative long-term effect on revenue because as you spend it down, your annual investment income decreases with it. So that discipline is much of the difference between an orchestra that weathers a bad year and one that ends up in the headlines. So if you've gotten this far, here is the practical version, and it is very simple. If you care about the art, donate. That is the single most direct thing you can do for an orchestra's cash flow or for any arts institution. And it does not have to be a large gift. Every gift counts. And yes, please attend more often too. Full houses are the signal that convinces donors that the whole thing is worth funding. And it convinces individual ticket buyers that this is a worthwhile experience that they should return to. Every seat you fill is one less seat that an orchestra has to race to discount or that goes empty. So the next time the lights go down and you open your program book, know that you are experiencing one of the most unusual business models in the world. A thing that cannot pay for itself, kept alive on purpose because enough people decided it was worth keeping. That is the strange economics of an orchestra. And if you found this video interesting, the rest of this channel is about how these organizations actually run from the inside. I make videos for people who keep arts organizations going and for anyone curious about how they work. You can start with the video linked right here. Please take a moment to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.